Time for yet another fun video that we all like to see constantly. Alright, this is my 2002 158 Freightliner Sprinter. Of course, the Freightliner is just a few different things, but pretty much the same. I work in sound for a living, so I decided to completely wrap my van in sound deadening butyl mat. This is 80 mil, which is pretty thick. If you don't know what this stuff is, go look it up, but essentially it's just butyl tar with a aluminum foiling backing. It's pretty malleable, but it absorbs low frequency sounds really well. Here's a better piece of what it is. See? So anyway, I put it all over my van. I've done a lot of research on this, and a lot of people say it's pretty much diminishing returns, but I completely disagree with that, because after we did the roof, it changed. It was the biggest change in sound dampening. But let's talk about what it is that makes sound in your van, because I've seen a lot of questions, people asking, how do I make my van quieter? Specifically, they're talking about the cab. So when you're driving, you obviously don't want to hear that. If you have a partition here, you're not going to hear the stuff that's happening back here anyway. So what I did is, when I took the engine out, I took this stuff and put it all over the engine bay, and I'll post a few pictures. That meant I had to remove everything, and it was well worth it in my opinion, because my friends who owned this before I did, I took them for a drive, and they said it's much quieter as far as hearing the engine noise. But there is one caveat to that, in that the vent that's up front here, that's where it comes in, right inside there. I'm zooming in because I'm stuck behind the chair, but it's right there, and it's a giant open hole, and that does let some sound in. And sound insulation is the same thing as temperature insulation. If air can flow through, then sound can flow through. So a tiny hole will actually let in a lot more sound than you think, and the giant hole is going to let in a decent amount of sound. So if I can find some way to change that porting in there, put some cotton batting in, maybe that'll make it quieter. I don't know. It's a high frequency sound, so we'll see what happens. But back to this part of the van. So what makes it vibrate is essentially just rattling metal. It doesn't even have to hit anything. It just has to kind of rattle. It's like if you took a saw, and an old hand saw, and you go up and down with it, you hear it go woo, 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 woo. That's because the metal itself is vibrating, even not against something else. So we have the same principle here. This panel, though it is welded at these seams, will still vibrate, but not as much when you have something like this on it, because it absorbs those low frequency vibrations, which is technically energy. So you want to absorb energy, and you dissipate it somewhere else. And technically energy goes to heat. That's a long story. So putting it all over the ceiling has made a huge impact. I put it everywhere I could. That wasn't stupid. Like, I'm not going to fill in that tiny gap, but I do think this was pretty worthwhile. And then I noticed another thing after it was dampened. I was still getting vibrations, but why? And a little bit came from the doors, which is to be expected. But then I realized, if you look between these ribs here, well, you can just see straight through. And in some cases, they're so close that the top here will go back and forth, and it hits these ribs. Well, you can see old insulation in there, but it is a 20-year-old vehicle at this point, and that insulation is just kind of, I don't mean insulation, I'm sorry, it's like a foam rubber caulking that's supposed to absorb and help these things from vibrating in each other if they're not already attached. And even if they are attached, they're still going to vibrate. So I thought, how can I keep that from happening? And that answer, some of you are now figuring out. Wooden shims. I took these wooden shims, got a box of them from Home Depot. Very inexpensive. I think it was like $5. You get a lot of them. And if you don't know what a shim is, it's essentially, it's a wedge. It's a very thin wedge. They use these to make the doors in your house square or plumb. So you can take one of these guys, and we're going to start here, because this is a prime example of why it does and does not work. So you see it's moving already, right? This one, that's the one I want. So in order to keep this from hitting this with vibrations, we put this inside. But that means one of two things. If this is flexing back and forth, then it goes one way and gets tighter. If it goes the other way, it's going to get looser. So that means over time, those small amounts of being loose will let these back out, back out, back out, back out, back out. And we're talking fractions of a millimeter until eventually it just builds up. So these will not stay over time unless you find a way to glue them together and make them work that way, work better. A lot of these are pretty solid, otherwise they're not going anywhere. But I do know over time that's going to change. So the idea here is you take a shim. I was really trying to pull these out by hand, but I hammered some of them in, and literally hammered. You can see the hammer marks. Try to find one that I can undo by hand. Yeah, technical difficulties, right? Whatever, we'll go back to this one. So, essentially what you have is two of them, and you put them opposite of each other. So you slide one in to pretty tight, but not incredibly tight, because the idea is you want to slide the other one in to fill that gap, right? So once I have it through on the other side, I would generally, with two hands, I'm using my elbow, hammer in the other side. So I'm just putting more and more distance between this rib and the outer body. If you have a hammer, obviously it's going to be a lot easier. You can use a rubber mallet, you can use a regular hammer, it doesn't matter. And you just go until they're really, really tight, and that will make a huge difference for all of the things that vibrate against the roof and anything else you can find. So I kind of just went around my van, and I would hit the walls and I would listen for those vibrations. You hear that? So there's something up front that's vibrating. Get a little bit closer. And it's the door. I haven't done this door because I have one at the window I'm putting on. But if we listen again, there's nothing else that's vibrating in here anymore. If I took all these out, you would hear it vibrate a little bit. Now, another question, some might be asking, well, why not just put more mat in between? Why not put caulking in between or something else? Well, as I said before, it's going to vibrate back and forth. This is a vehicle. Everything's going to vibrate a lot. So over time, it's just going to keep pushing and 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 pushing until eventually this just thins out to nothing. Kind of like this if I'm doing it with my finger, okay? So over time, this would just thin out to nothing. Since I'm insulating this with foam and putting stuff up, that would be a problem because I can't get back in and fix it. So we have to do it right the first time. Doing it right in this case is trying to figure out how. So I think I'm probably going to take some wood glue and glue these puppies up, put a ton of glue on there, and then hammer them in. And then once they're in there, I'll probably take a chisel and cut off the extra stuff so these can stay over time. And you know what? If they do back out, whatever. It is what it is, but I won't be able to repair it. So that's one of the things to consider when trying to make your van quieter. Deaden it, really, it's not a big deal. This 158 took 4 boxes, actually 3 and third, I guess. This is what's left. This is how these sheets come out. Just like that. And it's $65 a box from Amazon. You get 4 sheets per fold, and there's like 4 of those in there. So I guess we can use a little over half. My wife did some of the work in here, so I'm not sure what was left over. I keep the extra pieces because you can end up using those to fill in small things, or make a whole big one, depending on what you want. But it took about 4 on the 158. I'm going to do behind there as well, because as some of you know, you can really feel the heat radiate. These are your first layer of defense against heat because they absorb it pretty well. Obviously, once it absorbs it, it has to dissipate it somewhere. If it can't dissipate it, then it holds on to it and puts it back into the metal and everything else. So I'm going to do all the tops in here, and then eventually I'm going to also spray the foam in there too, because that's a huge gap, and I just want to give it some more insulation. But that's it. That's how I keep my van quieter. It worked out really well. I did remove the original FedEx vent right here, All I did was get a piece of sheet metal and cut it wider than the circles, drilled holes, sprayed self-etching primer on it so the primer bonds, cuts into the metal and bonds that way, and then it cocked it up and blah blah blah, the rest is history. Well, that's about it today. 15,000 BTU air conditioner for those of you wondering, and it takes about an hour to make this van 75 degrees when it's 95 out, so 20-degree difference in an hour for a non-insulated van, not bad. So anyway, that's it.